Hi, everyone. Welcome to our first Library Discovery Hour of this academic year. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm Anna Chen, Associate University Librarian for Special Collections and Director of Wilson Library at UNC. And we are excited to bring you this event series, which gives you an up-close look at the university libraries and gives you a chance to meet the librarians and archivists behind all the stories that we share. So today's program is the first of 4 discovery hours that are planned between now and April. And we have a really great lineup of discovery hours this year, and we hope you can enjoy them all. And today we are thrilled to have about 100 people on this call. So settle in, all 100 of you, for the next hour with your lunch if you're on the East Coast, or maybe a comforting beverage if it's a time of day that is different from lunch from where you are. So what we have in store for you today is a look at our women's athletics program at Carolina, which is also one of the most successful in the country. And as we learn more about this program, we will also hear about the university archives at Wilson Library, and we'll see how archival collections can help us connect with stories, not only from the past, but the present and the future too. So I am very pleased to introduce our speaker today, Nicholas Graham, our university archivist. Nick has worked in Wilson Library for more than 20 years, including in the North Carolina collection and as the first program coordinator of the North Carolina Digital Heritage Center. He's also the co-author with Cecilia Moore of UNC A to Z, What Every Tar Heel Needs to Know About the First State University, published by UNC Press. So Nick knows university history top to bottom, and you are in for a treat today. I'm also pleased to say that field hockey head coach Aaron Matson has recorded a special video for us to share with you today. Aaron Matson is the most decorated player in Carolina field hockey history. And on January 31st, 2023, she was announced as the next head coach of the program in which she starred. With her at the helm, the Tar Heels won the program's 11th national championship and the 26th ACC championship. And we are thrilled to showcase the unique connection between athletics at Carolina and the university libraries. So we will share Coach Matson's video after the presentation and then open it up to your questions. And speaking of questions, you can submit them or comments anytime during the presentation by typing them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And now I will turn things over to Nick.
Thanks, Anna, and thanks everyone for being here. I'm pleased to be back here again, talking with you all about university history. Last year, I tackled a sort of mystery with the question, did Hinton James really walk all the way to Chapel Hill? This year, I'm not presenting any mysteries to investigate, but I'm asking a seemingly more simple question, how did we get here? UNC Chapel Hill has, without question, as Anna mentioned, one of the most successful women's athletics programs in the country. If we measure this only by looking at NCAA team championships, Carolina's women's teams are beating the men's teams 39-13, and the men had about a quarter-century head start. This was not always the case. Carolina has fielded popular men's athletic teams since the 1880s. By comparison, the success of women's athletics has been fairly recent occurrence. So how did we get here? Or, to give a more specific example of the before and after, how did we get from 1930, when the Daily Tar Heel covered women's sports using the dismissive nickname Tar Heelettes, and this article illustrates that the success on in this case, the basketball court was not particularly strong either. This is a report of the UNC club team losing a close game to Chapel Hill High School. How did we get from there to here? Women's sports presented as front page news in special editions of the Daily Tar Heel. This is from earlier this year in 2025. In this presentation, I'm going to do a couple of things. First, I want to trace the history of women's athletics at Carolina as it is documented in the Wilson Special Collections Library. And second, I want to highlight our athletics archives by talking a little bit about the primary collections I used and to tell you how they got here. Because this is a big topic and we don't have all afternoon, I decided to pick one sport to focus on as a sort of case study. I picked field hockey in part because it is Carolina's most recent sports dynasty, although, to be honest, women's lacrosse could also make a case for that. Field hockey has won 5 NCAA championships in the past 10 years, and also it has a history on campus that predates even the arrival of the first women students at UNC. I will say as we get started that while I will be focusing on field hockey, I have neither the time and definitely not the expertise to go deep on topics like game strategy and recruiting. This will really be an overview of how the university's support for women's athletics, and field hockey specifically, has developed over nearly 100 years. Carolina's history of intercollegiate sports competition goes back to the 1880s when football and baseball teams were established. Basketball is a relative newcomer. UNC didn't form a varsity team until 1911. However, UNC students were playing sports and games on campus well before the first official teams were established. For information on early Carolina history, the first source I usually look to is Camp Plummer Battle's comprehensive history of UNC through its first century. Here's what Battle has to say about games on campus during the school's early years. Athletics was not under university supervision in any degree. The games were in summer marbles and cooler weather bandy, often called shinny. The latter was peculiarly exciting. Nearly all the students were engaged. The ball was of hard wood, turned round, and when struck by curved sticks wielded by powerful arms, spun through the air with fearful velocity. That sounds an awful lot like field hockey to me. It might even be fair to argue, if we agree with that interpretation, that of all the team sports played on campus today, field hockey has the longest history at the university. Given the time period Battle was writing about, this still would have been an all-male campus. In order to begin to trace the history of women's field hockey at UNC, we need to look briefly at a timeline of women students at Carolina. Women are first admitted to UNC on a restricted basis, limited only to graduate programs, and then for their junior and senior years. Because there was at first no housing for women on campus, extracurricular activities were limited. As the number of women students steadily increased, so too did the demand for opportunities to get together outside of class. By 1925, when the first dorm for women, Spencer Hall, was opened, women on campus began pushing for access to spaces that had previously been used solely by men students. The Dean of Women consistently advocated for time for women students on the university's tennis courts, playing fields, and in the gymnasium. This fight for space would be a consistent theme throughout the history of women's athletics at UNC. For a good part of this discussion, I relied a great deal on a dissertation by Victoria Jackson called Title IX in the Big Time, Women's Intercollegiate Athletics at UNC Chapel Hill. Dr. Jackson is a Tar Heel alumna and a former college athlete competing as a distance runner on the UNC track team. Her dissertation, which relies very heavily on the UNC University archives, was completed at Arizona State University in 2015 and is available through their institutional repository. The first formal organization for women's athletics at Carolina came in 1934, which students established as the Women's Athletic Association. The initial focus was intramural sports. Tennis and basketball were the most popular sports among the women students at this time, and dance was often included in the offerings. So too was field hockey. The earliest reference I could find in the Daily Tar Heel was this notice from 1936 for the co-ed field hockey team. While it's notable that field hockey was offered this early, it did not appear to be initially popular. In 1937, as we see in the report here, the team didn't have enough players to make up 2 11-person teams, and they had to recruit a group of male students just to have somebody to scrimmage against. Frances Hogan, the longtime director of women's athletics at UNC, remembered a strong interest in the sport, however, by the 1940s. Field hockey is an old sport at UNC. In the 40s, enthusiasm and excitement for the game is as intense as it is now. This was from an oral history that Hogan did with the Southern Oral History program in 1991. She described a time in that oral history when the field hockey players during a practice at Kenan Stadium were being heckled by the football team. Hogan walked over to the football players and pointed out that there were no substitutions and timeouts in field hockey and that the game was nearly continuous running for 2 35-minute halves. When she asked if any of the football players wanted to give it a try, that put an end to the heckling. By 1946, field hockey was listed as first and foremost among the team sports, with the team practicing twice a week on Emerson Field and making plans for their first games against other schools. I've tried to find the earliest photos I could of field hockey at Carolina. I've yet to find anything for the 1930s or early 1940s. The earliest photo of a field hockey player I came across was this one from 1949, taken by Hugh Morton, who was then a student. The player, who's not identified, looks to be sitting along the wall by the intramural field where the team must have practiced. With the campus struggling to keep up with the boom in enrollment following World War II, the fight for practice and playing time for women's club sports became even more intense. In Frances Hogan's oral history interview, she remembers a specific incident during a field hockey game against Meredith College. The teams were playing on Emerson Field after Hogan had received permission from the baseball coach. And I've got an excerpt from Hogan's oral history that I want to play here.
Field hockey, the last team I had, we were playing Meredith College, and we played where the student union building is now. That was a first, because the baseball diamond was there, and they had agreed that we could use the outfield if we could get the thing going on that. We could use that much of that baseball field. So here we were playing, and we'd just been maybe 5 minutes into the game when the band came out. They just started their practice right out in the middle of our game. I marched right through, and the Meredith team had to go home, and we never played that game. Now that is the way it was back then. We had to fight for every little...
Sorry, that cut off at the end. She was saying we had to fight for every little thing. Just a quick note about Frances Hogan, whose voice we just heard. Hogan spent 38 years at Carolina, hired first as a PE instructor and retiring in 1985 as the Associate Director of Athletics. She spent her entire career at Carolina advocating for women's sports. Her work clearly laid the foundation for the success of women's athletics at UNC today. Going back to 1949, that was not the last clash between the field hockey team and the marching band. In November 1949, both were trying to practice at the same time in Kenan Stadium. This time, when the marching band took the field, one of the field hockey players hit the ball into the middle of the band formation, and the rest charged the musicians, sticks at the ready. The Daily Tar Heel referred to it as the hockey stick drumstick controversy. In this case, they came to a compromise, with the band pushing back its regular practice time by a half hour in order to give the field hockey team time to finish. By 1950, the team was playing games against other schools, with scheduled matches against Duke, Elon, and Guilford College. During this era, women's teams were restricted to playing against schools within a 50-mile radius of Chapel Hill. For these early decades of the Women's Athletic Association, I've had to rely primarily on newspaper reports. There are some archival records, but these don't start appearing consistently until the 1950s. When records we expect to find in the archives do not appear there, it could be for a number of reasons. Either they were never created in the first place, they were created but were lost or thrown away, or they were created and are still sitting in an office or storage unit somewhere on campus. And remember that point, I'm going to come back to it later. In order to follow this history, I looked through the archival records year by year to try to trace the evolution and growth of the UNC field hockey program. And here are some highlights of what I found. The first Women's Athletic Association guidebook we have, possibly the first created, is from the 1951-52 school year. You can see here it was clearly handmade with copied sheets stapled together. Field hockey is one of the sports featured, described as the co-ed's football imitation. Women's athletics are getting some attention, but clearly not being taken seriously at this point. By 1958, the guidebook was being printed professionally. The guide encouraged students to join the field hockey team, and in this case, they were planning a game against Women's College, which is now UNC Greensboro. Although the picture shown is from one of the dance classes that I think was probably still more popular. By the 1960s, the field hockey team sometimes shows up in the work of the official university photographers. The photo on the left shows them with a bus, so I assume they were playing away games at the time. And on the right shows the team during a practice in Kenan Stadium. By the 1960s, field hockey continued to be featured in the WAA catalogs, this one from 1964. Throughout the 60s, there was a steady increase in the number of women students at UNC, and this led to a growing interest in club sports. In 1971, the teams were finally organized into a recognized intercollegiate athletic program when UNC joined as the charter member of the Association for Intercollegiate Athletics for Women. Field hockey was one of the initial sports offered, along with volleyball, tennis, gymnastics, fencing, and swimming. The AIAW was in roughly the same model as the NCAA, which the men's teams had been a part of since the 1920s. However, the AIAW sought to differentiate itself from the NCAA, which it was already viewing as too commercial and too focused on athletics over academics. Once UNC joined the intercollegiate organization, the coaches of the women's teams began to produce regular annual reports recapping the season and talking about their plans for the future. Here's an excerpt from the first report from the 1971 season. The girls really want a team for the 1972 season. Most of this year's members are returning and have already asked if there will be a team this year. So at this point, clearly the future of field hockey seemed far from certain at UNC. What I found especially interesting about this report was the request for help with publicity. No interviews were done this year. Field hockey is getting more popular in the South. TV or any type of publicity would be a great way of promoting field hockey. UNC had a well-established sports information office at this point, but it was not yet devoting resources to the women's teams. The 1972 report noted that the team suffered through its first full year of competition, ending with a record of 3 wins, 7 losses, and 2 ties. I was excited to see that this folder also included a few photos, some of the earliest we have of the women's intercollegiate team. These annual reports for coaches are an important insight into their consistent advocacy for more support. The reports usually include a summary of the team season, a list of injuries, some highlights, and a list of recommendations that nearly always call for more access to practice spaces, more financial support, and help with media coverage. In the mid-1970s, UNC, along with other schools in the country, was working hard to try to interpret and apply the new regulations that came with the passage of Title IX of the Education Amendments, which prohibited gender discrimination in higher education. While the legislation was initially passed in 1972, it took several years for the federal government to develop specific guidelines for implementation, especially around athletics. During this time, there was a lot of work and discussion happening at UNC. Because this often took the form of letters and memos, we have a good record of the Title IX discussions in the university archives. Frances Hogan was primarily focused on fighting to have a seat at the table. Unfortunately, but perhaps not surprisingly, the coaches of the women's teams were rarely consulted. Athletic Director Homer Rice, on the other hand, who worried that Title IX would negatively impact men's basketball and football, sought to delay any changes in hope that the legislation would be amended, and he even went so far as to encourage boosters to lobby legislators to revise the requirements. Ultimately, it was UNC Chancellor Farabee Taylor who pushed the athletic department to move ahead with plans for increased support for women's teams. By 1978, at least some athletic department staff were beginning to be outspoken about Carolina's commitment to women's sports, as shown in this quote from Associate Athletic Director at the time and currently an emeritus member of the Friends of the Library Board, Moyer Smith. The call for support for women's athletics was great, but the idea that they had to move slowly was not very well received by many coaches and athletes. Year by year, we begin to see gradual changes start to be applied, and the archival record shows a steady increase in support for the field hockey team. This news release from 1975 is one of the first issued by the Sports Information Office to promote a field hockey player. It's notable, too, that providing publicity for women's sports was one of the Title IX requirements. In 1980, the field hockey team appeared on TV for the first time in what was then a newly established cable channel, ESPN. It's possible that field hockey may have appeared on ESPN before any of the other UNC men's sports. The athletic department also around this time began to produce publications promoting field hockey. One of the first, actually both examples here, are single sheet brochures. The one on the left is for the field hockey and volleyball teams. I believe that these sports were grouped together because they were coached by the same person. This was still years before coaching women's teams was a full-time job. Often coaches taught PE classes at the university or held other jobs. The early 1980s brought major changes to women's college athletics in general and a significant one to Carolina field hockey. In 1981, the NCAA began to offer championships in women's sports, and that same year, UNC hired Karen Shelton as head coach for field hockey. The American Association for Intercollegiate Athletics for Women remained popular with many of its participants. However, once the NCAA began to offer championships in women's sports, the move was inevitable. University administrators liked the idea of having all sports being part of one governing body, and coaches and athletes hoped the move would raise the profile of women's athletics. These were complicated discussions both at the university and national level, and Victoria Jackson's dissertation goes into this at length, and it's really an interesting read. At Carolina, UNC was looking for a new field hockey coach following the departure of Dolly Hunter, who had coached the team for 5 years. Records of job searches rarely show up in the archival record, and we would not actively collect them today, but occasionally some materials do show up in older collections. In a file on field hockey coaches in the Department of Athletics records, I found this thank you note from Karen Shelton, written following her interview on campus 1981. In the letter to Frances Hogan, she wrote, I see great potential in the field hockey program and believe that the hockey team has the ability to become yet another national intercollegiate contender at UNC. I believe I could make a significant contribution in the realization of this potential and would like the opportunity to work with the team. Their enthusiasm is inspiring. It is a nice letter, but it's pretty standard for what you might expect from any enthusiastic job candidate following an interview. What makes it especially compelling, especially in Shelton's thoughts that she could make a significant contribution to the team. Looking back on that now, we know how the story ends. Shelton was hired. She led the team for 42 years, winning 10 NCAA championships, and retired as the winningest coach in college field hockey history. The team now plays in Karen Shelton Stadium. So that's where we're headed, but let's go back to 1981 for a minute. It was a big deal a few years ago when Aaron Matson was hired as the field hockey head coach right out of college, but Karen Shelton was just 2 years out of college when she came to UNC. At the time, coaching was still not a full-time job, and Shelton continued to play for the U.S. national field hockey team. She would not become a full-time coach until 1989, which was the first year UNC fielded a full-time and funded a full-time field hockey coach. Shelton followed the lead of her predecessors in being a tireless advocate for the field hockey team. This was evident in her annual reports, where she pushed for more funding for coaches and travel and better publicity for the team. And as noted in this section shown here, she also addressed concerns with the team's long-standing rival, the marching band. Due to conflicts with band practices in Kenan Stadium, field hockey practices often ran until 10 p.m. on many weeknights. Even with the late-night practices, the team began to have more success on the field. The 1982-83 team was the first to appear in national field hockey rankings, rising as high as 11th. During this time, we also see better publicity materials, many of these modeled after what students were used to seeing, like these posters for men's basketball and football. The 1980s were also when we begin to see Carolina's women's teams and other sports having success on a national level. The women's soccer team won its first NCAA tournament in 1982 and would win 6 more national championships before the end of the decade. For the first time, field hockey and other women's sports did not have to look to the men's teams for an example of how to build a championship program at UNC. In the archives, the growing profile of the team is evident in records showing a greater promotion, better media coverage, and a renewed emphasis on success on the field. For example, this form letter from 1980 was created for field hockey team members who had to miss class in order to play in a game. This is something that never would have happened in the intramural sports era. By 1983, the Friends of Field Hockey published its first newsletter, a sign of the beginnings of an active fundraising effort which would be essential for the future of the program. Also in 1983, the first field hockey media guide was published. It was not professionally printed, but it had everything you'd expect to find in a media guide, complete with statistics and year-by-year reports. So you can see here building all of the components of a successful program, following the lead of women's soccer, but also following the lead of the men's programs on campus. Provide more success on the field. This 1983 Daily Tar Heel headline, "Prospects Looking Up for Hockey," turned out to be quite accurate. In 1983, the field hockey team earned its first Atlantic Coast Conference championship, and in 1985, the team made headlines when they beat then number 1 ranked Old Dominion University. In 1987, they advanced to the final game of the NCAA tournament. By 1989, a big field hockey win was front page news in the Daily Tar Heel. Later that year, Carolina field hockey won its first NCAA championship, beating Old Dominion in a penalty shootout in the championship game. In a way, this closes the first part of the story. We've seen how field hockey at Carolina emerged from a rough, informal men's game in the 19th century, was taken up again in the 1930s as one of the first intramural sports for women, began intercollegiate competition casually, then more seriously in the 1970s before growing in the 1980s into a championship caliber program. This also closes the first part of the story because the records of the athletic department that we have in the archives become more sparse after the 1980s. There are still some records for the 1990s, but few after that. To pick up the story of field hockey in the 1990s and beyond, we have to look to other sources. The library has been consistently collecting media guides, and we have these for most years. I was also interested in seeing when field hockey showed up in the records of the Chancellor's office. Usually it's there just in the form of notes of congratulation, but in the records of Chancellor Michael Hooker, I found a great example of how success on the field can lead to greater investment in the program. In this letter from 1997, following the Tar Heels' third consecutive NCAA championship, Chancellor Hooker informed Karen Shelton that he's transferring $15,000 from the Chancellor's discretionary fund to be used to support the field hockey team. In 1999, the university dedicated Francis Henry Stadium, which is located, I believe, where the indoor football facility is located now. This was a new facility for use by the field hockey and lacrosse teams on AstroTurf, and complete with very nice locker rooms, as shown in the 2000 media guide, so in the image on the right here. This is a very long way from getting chased off the field by the marching band. The history of Carolina field hockey after 2000 is not yet fully documented in the archives, but is easy to follow through student and commercial media and through the work of UNC Athletics Communications. The team has now won 11 NCAA championships, plays in a state-of-the-art dedicated field hockey stadium, and is led by Aaron Matson, who as a player was one of the university's most decorated athletes in any sport, and whose hiring at age 23 made national news. At this point, I want to shift the focus a little bit and talk about how university records come to the archives and how this affects research on university history, especially recent topics. So as of pretty recently, there were no significant collections of athletics department records in the university archives. In 2009, some of our former colleagues received a call from the athletic department informing them that they were planning some renovations to Woolen Gym, and they'd found a bunch of old documents in the basement. They invited the archivist to have a look before they got rid of anything. So they walked over to the Woolen, visited the basement area with a staff member, and found things in pretty rough condition. Here are a few of the photos they took. As an aside, I will say that these kinds of visits are fairly common in our work. I wasn't on this one, this was before I started the archives, but I have since been in many attics and basements all over campus. Thankfully, the conditions are usually not as bad as the ones shown here. While not everything stored in that space needed to be kept, the archivist identified 53 boxes of important athletic department records to be permanently preserved in Wilson Library. The materials they pulled out of the basement and worked with many archivists in Wilson to rebox, refolder, organize, and describe comprise a vital record of the history of Carolina athletics going as far back as the 1920s. This is a rare example where some documents can take over a half century to find their way from the department to the archives, but it is not a unique one. The Athletics Archives in Wilson Library also include a separate collection of materials from the Athletics Communication Office, formerly the Sports Information Office. These staff members do incredible work documenting and telling the story of Tar Heel sports. Just a few years ago, as they were facing an office move, we heard from the Communications Office inviting us to review some of their files to determine whether or not they'd be appropriate to move to the archives. So here are some of the boxes that we packed. We worked in the space, the office area of the Current Auditorium next to the Dean Dome, and ended up bringing over more than 200 boxes of materials. Old media guides, photographs, newspaper and magazine clippings, game programs, and stat sheets. It's a comprehensive record of all UNC sports from the mid-20th century through the 2010s. As I think about athletics archives at Carolina, there are always two thoughts running through my mind at the same time. First, how can we make sure we're doing everything we can to preserve and especially to share these collections? It won't surprise any of you to hear that these collections have been popular. We've used them to answer questions from former players and their families. They've been used in documentaries. They've supported research projects by UNC students and visiting scholars, and we've had Carolina faculty come in with their classes. Second, how can we collaborate with the Department of Athletics to ensure that the next generation of archival materials don't take a half century to make their way over to Wilson Library? How can we make sure they don't end up in the digital equivalent of the Woolen Gym basement? Part of the answer lies in education and relationship building. The other part lies in using new tools to preserve university records as they are created today. We already do a significant amount of work to archive university websites and regularly collect digital materials to preserve in the library's digital repository. This work requires a different approach, but it's one that we're prepared for in Wilson Library. Before I close, I wanted to share a brief message from a Carolina field hockey enthusiast, and this is not going to be a surprise anymore who it is, who was unable to make it to today's presentation.
Hi everyone, I'm Erin Matson, the head coach of the UNC field hockey program, and I just wanted to say thank you so much for being here today as friends of the library for this Discovery Hour. I also want to thank you for your interest in the history of women's sports here at Carolina, particularly field hockey. To our program, we enjoy celebrating all of the history. Obviously, our university has so much history to honor, and we couldn't preserve the history and make it accessible to the public without libraries. Our program is built off of honoring tradition and history while also innovating and staying one step ahead. And it takes people like you who care about just the same to be able to do so. So thank you again for supporting both the university libraries and the field hockey program here at Carolina. Go Heels!
Thanks to Coach Matson for sharing that video. We may not have a collection of trophies to show for our work in the library, but like the field hockey team, we are deeply committed to honoring history and consistent innovation, and both are going to be essential as we continue our work to document the growing and ever-changing university. So, thank you all.
That was great. Thanks so much for your fantastic presentation, Nick. And all right, now for your questions. So while we are waiting for some questions to come in, I can start us off. I really liked that you talked about gaps in the record. What gaps would you say still exist in the archival record for women's athletics? And is there anything that you're hoping to find?
That's a great question. I think one of the things that, to simplify, it'd be the voice of former players and probably a little bit more from coaches. So we have, documentation, like I said, letters and memos, but it's so important when we can supplement them with personal reflections. And an example of that was that oral history from Frances Hogan. So that story about being chased off the field hockey team the field hockey team being chased off the field was not one that appears in the record. Certainly not as colorfully as she presents it. So I think that there could be work for us to do in the future to talk about, perhaps oral histories or other ways of capturing thoughts especially from players and coaches.
Yeah, that's great. All right, we've got a question from the audience, and here it is. More than 50 years after its passage, Title IX continues to influence the landscape of collegiate athletics. From your perspective, what have been the most enduring impacts of Title IX on the development, equity, and visibility of women's athletics at UNC Chapel Hill?
That's a fantastic question. It's not one that I am very well qualified to answer, but I will say you can trace it through how things appear in the record. You don't have to compare the women's teams in their treatment on campus to any sort of national picture. Often when you're doing university history work, one of the challenges is trying to figure out whether this is a national trend that was happening here, or it was something that's unique to university. So certainly the growth of UNC women's sports matched that of places at other schools. But in order to look for kind of a path for how things moved here, it's much easier to just compare how the women's teams were treated to how the men's teams were treated. And so, those examples I showed from the early, handmade guidebooks, the single sheet brochures, those were contrasted at the time to some really nice professional, game programs and media guides for the men's teams. And if you follow that up to the present, the media guides, the materials used to publicize the women's teams are very much on par with what we see for all the men's teams. And that's true just walking around campus here. When there's a women's volleyball or basketball or field hockey game, there's signs all over campus. It's promoted on university social media. So the often, not always, often the number of people in the stands doesn't match those of the men's teams, especially basketball and football. But this kind of support and treatment that the teams receive, from the university, especially from athletics communications, it seems to be very much on par. But again, sorry, despite the rambling answer, I'm not the best qualified to answer that one.
No, that's great. And it's great to kind of think about record keeping for these various sports and how to ensure that women's sports history is preserved and shared equally. Question number two, can you give a sense of available materials for some other sports, especially women's sports at UNC? For example, gymnastics, swimming.
It's pretty comparable to what I was able to find for field hockey. So there are really good records of the Women's Athletic Association and then the records of the other organizations that followed, probably from some go back to the 1920s, but really from like the 1950s through the 1980s. Really strong year-by-year reports, and then following that, the sources that are going to be most helpful will be the things from Athletic Communications. So that those 200 boxes that we brought over included a lot of photos, included a lot of newspaper clippings, magazine clippings, press releases, stat sheets. So incredibly rich, sport by sport for men's and women's teams.
Great. Are there yearbooks of various sports that you still need or are specifically looking for?
Probably. I don't have a list yet, but that's something that we're talking about making probably a student project. Hopefully next semester, we're going to go through year by year and figure out what media guides we have and which ones are missing. And we will absolutely. I mean, first I'll bug the athletics, but if they don't have extras, then we'll absolutely put out a call for anything that people may have that they'd be willing to share.
Can you talk about the process you go through to identify all these documents and put this presentation together?
Yes. So it was really kind of the process I go through for any university history project. First I look to see what work has already been done, and in this case, that there's a dissertation from Victoria Jackson that I cited. And there are some other student master's papers and honors papers that were helpful as well. The first place I look, because it is comprehensive and easy to search, is the digitized Daily Tar Heel, which the library has digitized through the North Carolina Digital Heritage Center, and it covers over 100 years. So that was where I could find early mentions and see when field hockey starts to appear. And then, because we had picked this topic a while ago, I had time to go through the athletic department records, especially the folders on field hockey year by year, to see what was there. So I did that for the Department of Athletics, for Athletics Communications, and then I also looked for where, year by year, for where field hockey showed up in Chancellor's records. So it was really kind of a systematic process.
I wanted to insert my own question here because of how you answered this question. I was interested in the comments that you made, both in your presentation, but also in answering this question about where you had to turn for information depending on what point in the history of women's sports you were researching. So I was wondering if you could say anything more about any trends that you've noticed in record keeping about women's sports.
Not necessarily about women's sports, but more broadly, and this applies to university records or any record keeping. So there's a period when the university was very small, and there's pretty much all the documentation is in handwritten correspondence between university presidents or faculty members. Getting into the 20th century, especially post World War I, you see this professionalization of office staff. And so most offices, especially larger departments and organizations like athletics, would have had office managers, people often with the job title of secretary, who were charged with keeping documentation and filing it. And so the records that we have for that period are fantastic. And this was when a lot of university communication was happening on paper too. So they're it's possible to read and preserve them. That universities and most modern offices don't operate as much like that now. So pretty much everyone, will handle their own correspondence. The amount of it is much greater than it was when people were typing letters by hand. So there's this period, and the athletic department records reflect that, of professional office management, typewritten materials, super easy to go through and read, and they were kept very organized in the office. So when it came time to transfer to the archives, it's easy. now digital materials, there's more of them, they're more duplicated, and they're much messier. And other outside of maybe a few of the large offices on campus, that kind of organization and selection is not happening. So it makes our work as archivists much harder to figure out what's there, what's worth keeping, what doesn't need to or shouldn't be kept.
Interesting. Yeah, thank you. Okay, next question. What is the best way for the public to access these materials and enjoy them?
We have guides to all of our collections in Wilson Library on our website. There's an easy search box, and you can pull up the guide for the Records of Athletics Department, for example, and then you can make a request directly from there. Some materials are digitized. For that collection, a lot are not. So you could make a request, make an appointment, and then come by and take a look at Wilson Library.
Cool. Can you say a little bit about what your thoughts might be about the importance of having women's sports programs documented in the university archives?
It's really, our mission is to preserve and share the history of the university. And this is such a vital part of, student life, institutional life at UNC Chapel Hill. And it's also something, so we're going to do that anyway, but it's more exciting when it's topics that people are interested in, especially students. So there's incredible interest in the history of women's athletics, especially the effects of Title IX. So that it's more inspiring to us to collect and preserve and share these types of materials.
Great. Beyond Title IX, were there particular university policies, administrative decisions, or strategic initiatives that played a pivotal role in shaping the development and success of women's athletics at UNC Chapel Hill?
Yes. So, that timeline I shared showed, just a few milestones in the history of, women at UNC. Women's admission, admission to Carolina was on a restricted basis for more than a half century. So, for many years, students had to live in Chapel Hill in order to attend UNC. So a lot of the first generations of women students were daughters of, faculty. Then there, after the UNC system, the first implementation of the UNC system was established. One of the institutions of the three-university system was what was known as Women's College, which is now UNC Greensboro. And so there was pressure on UNC Chapel Hill to limit admission of women so as not to compete with Women's College. And so for many years, and I mentioned this, I think, admission of women was restricted to people just in their junior and senior years. So usually people would go to do, and there are, staff members and faculty here now who remember, doing their first 2 years at a place like St. Mary's or Peace College, and then coming to do their to finish their degree at UNC Chapel Hill. Title IX removed all restrictions on admission of women, made women eligible to come to UNC, under the same, standards as everyone else. And the population of women students boomed after that. So, Title IX passed 1972. By 1979, women made up the majority of students in the entering class, and that's continued through to the present. So, that came about right as so we begin to see a majority of women students at UNC. Title IX is being implemented, and so I think that was a huge boost for women's athletics at Carolina.
Great. I really enjoyed your recounting of the feud between the field hockey team and the marching band. Did you come across any other surprising or lesser known stories from the early days?
That was my favorite. Fighting for space. There's something I didn't include, but there was a lot of talk about access to lockers in the locker room. And there was even, one of the first Title IX complaints filed by women students at UNC was over access to lockers. And they did a study of the total number of available lockers, how they were distributed. So things like that, which like the band dispute, were evidence of I didn't say this explicitly, but I hope it came through in the presentation. This success of this program, the women's programs at UNC, by far the biggest factors in that were the athletes and the students, fighting for every bit of space and time they could, supported by amazing coaches. And so, fighting back against the band or, like really pushing for locker space were small examples of that.
Great. Could you say if you have any thoughts about ways that current athletes, coaches, fans can contribute to preserving their history for future generations?
I think that's a great question. Supporting, one is being conscious of, the ways that the work that they're doing now is being captured. And I think that, that's being done better than ever. One of the journalism faculty members has been working with students to make documentaries of championship teams. But even outside of that, field hockey, for example, they're releasing mini documentaries every. I don't know how often they do it, but they've done 3 so far, I think, this season. Recapping several games at a time and interviewing players. So they're doing tremendous work to document the game today and the players today. I think I'd go back to what I said before, thinking about, after playing, when people are here, they're focusing on being students or focusing on being student athletes. That's great. Thinking about after their time as students, as student athletes has done, how they can share reflections of their experiences. And, if it comes far after someone graduated and they're able to be candid about things that, may be of interest to, students now or historians, that's great. But I think the work the athletic department is doing now, we're going to have a richer picture than ever of the game on the field. But I think too about ways that we can capture kind of the personal stories behind them, and sometimes those do come much later.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. Okay, here's a longish one. To better enable your continued access to digital records that are created within the athletic departments, would it be possible for the UNC libraries to automatically have these records saved to an archival database when these communication materials are initially developed?
That's a great question. Short answer, to some extent that's happening. So assuming that all of university documentation should be used with the tools that the university provides, and they are maintained on shared storage that is maintained by the university. What makes this more complicated is that and this goes back to what I was saying about the era of very hands-on professional office staff. We don't want everything. There's a great deal of material that is created by offices all over campus, not just athletics, that either it's ephemeral information, maybe they're drafts or memos about parking, things that we don't want. There's also a great deal of personal and sensitive information in university records, and I'm sure there's going to be a ton of this in athletics. We don't want that either. Because of the way that we're staffed and we're set up, and because of the massive volume of documentation created by a modern university, only a fraction of what's produced would be material that we'd want to preserve in the archives. And so the biggest part of our job is working with the offices to help them think ahead to, as they're creating materials or as they're organizing or going through records, thinking about what to set aside for future transfer to the archives. So I mean, technically, yes, I think that would be possible, but I don't. I shudder to think at the amount of work that would be involved to have to weed through everything and just pick the good stuff. We need the cooperation of all of the departments on campus in order to be able to do that effectively.
Great. Um, Here's another question that maybe allows you to expand on that in any direction that you wish.
Sure.
So basically, it is hypothetically, if you were king for a day and you had a magic wand and could change anything you would like to change or make anything happen that you wanted to happen, what would you prioritize to enhance the future development of the university's library archives?
Oh, that's a great question. I think we need a brand new, not new, but a revitalized Wilson Library. That would be fantastic. And if anyone has thoughts of, anyone wants to hear more about that, we can. We have things to share. Not that it's happening, but we have visions. So brand new Wilson Library would be great. I honestly, what I would change that is, also feasible, like a brand new Wilson Library, would be having every department on campus have the ability or the requirement to set aside time to organize and weed and set aside their office records for permanent preservation. So again, this goes back to what I keep saying about the professional office staff. We need that work to happen, in the moment is when it's most valuable, when there are people there who can identify like, oh, this is the good stuff, or this is, the important material that we're going to need to be able to tell the story of our work in the future. So it's not hard work, but it's rarely at the top of anyone's to-do list, and it's very future focused. It doesn't solve any immediate problems for offices unless they're losing things on a regular basis. But that's something, again, after the new Wilson Library, that I'd love if that could be a focus of everyone on campus.
That's great. Since we have just a few minutes left, I wanted to ask if you have any last words about stories about the history of women's sports that you would have liked to research and didn't get to because it was out of scope for this presentation, or anything more you want to say about your hopes and dreams for, what the future of the archives could look like.
I think I would have liked to have been able to spend a little more time getting deeper into some of the personalities. I think Frances Hogan had an amazing career here. I also think, and maybe others have written about this and I haven't found it yet, just looking at Karen Shelton's career here, and also the careers of Anson Dorrance and Jenny Levy, just thinking about how remarkable it is that UNC hired 3 coaches of women's programs who had decades-long unprecedented success. And was that luck? How did that happen? I think that's a fascinating story. Again, that maybe someone else has explored, but I would have liked to spend more time with.
Well, thank you for all that you've done to preserve these records. So it's possible for researchers of the future to do that. Thank you so much, Nick.
Thank you all.
And yes, thank you all again for joining us today. And special thanks to our friends of the library. We are so grateful for your continued support of the libraries here at Carolina. There is so much to discover about the university libraries and about how we enhance the experience of students and faculty and friends like you. So please mark your calendars for our next Library Discovery Hour on November 14th, where you will hear from current students and alumni about their incredible experiences in the Carolina Academic Library Associates program, just in time for the program's 25th anniversary. So thanks so much again, and see you in November.